Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Broker Daily. Today, I'm back with our real estate expert, attorney Ira Gold. And Ira, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thank you for coming. Thanks for coming, Ira.
Great to be here with you, Ed.
Good to see you. So let's jump right in, and we're going to dive deep today on land leases. So I'm out with a buyer. We're looking around for a property here in Manhattan. And I'll do a search, and all of a sudden, I'll see an apartment that is priced far below a comparable unit. And I'll say, wow, this is really inexpensive compared to everything else that's similar. My customer will say, well, wow, that's great. Let's go see that. I'll look into it, and usually what the case is, if there's a really gross discrepancy, is that this building will be a land lease building. And what that means is that it's a smaller percentage of most units that are for sale in Manhattan, which means that most buildings own the land that they're on, but this building leases the land that it's on, and that's a land lease building. So we'll jump into that. Ira, looking forward to talking about land leases. Tell us a little bit about that.
So, Ed, that's an interesting introduction. Recently, I had that exact thing happen with a friend of my daughter, a recent college graduate. She has a really good job, but, she's still struggling to kind of figure out what she can afford, and she'd like to buy something. And she called my daughter to speak to me because she came across a one-bedroom in a great area of the city for a little over $100,000. And I said to my daughter, it's not real. It's a scam. Something's up. And she sent me the listing, and I looked at it, and I realized, just as you just pointed out, that this was a land lease building. And more problematic for my daughter's friend was that the land lease was close to expiration. So, as you noted, most buildings, most co-ops own the land underneath the building, and that occurred when the co-op was converted, usually 30, 40, 50 years ago. The sponsor of the conversion bought both the land and the building. Sometimes, when that occurred, the owner of the land decided they would rather have a cash flow of rent, so they would sell the building but not the land. Now, in a land lease building, you have an issue because, like all leases, there's an endpoint to the lease. And if you are getting close to that endpoint, as was the case with my daughter's friend, it's very problematic because the co-op now only has two choices. Either they can negotiate to buy the land from the landlord so that they now own both the building and the land, or they get into a negotiation as to the new rent. Now, the formula for the rent is often incorporated in the lease. It's complicated. It involves all kinds of factors. None of them really good usually for the co-op. So the jump from an old lease to a new lease can be very high in the amount of money that the co-op now has to pay. So it's very problematic. The flip side to that is if you are looking at a land lease building and the lease is new, maybe it's got a 99-year period, some even more, you can get a pretty good deal. And you don't have to worry, at least immediately, about the lease running out. You can get a lot of value for the same apartment that was not on a land lease building. But you always have to keep in mind that, unlike most real estate, which you hope appreciates in value, by the nature of the beast, a land lease building starts to depreciate in value as you move closer to the endpoint of the lease.
Right, great point. So always important when you're out with your broker or if you're looking at apartments, just like Ira's daughter's friend, if it seems too good to be true, there's usually something under the cover. And here in New York, we're pretty fully baked. So there's usually a reason for that. Some of the buildings in the city, one big block, as we spoke about earlier, Ira's Battery Park City, right? So those are condos. So it's not a co-op, but they have land leases, so their HOAs are much higher.
Which is unusual. Most land leases tend to be co-op.
Right.
Almost overwhelmingly, there are some,
Mm-hmm.
as you just mentioned, condo land leases. Battery Park is a little unique. Well, not unique, but Battery Park is a little different from the scenario of the building that my daughter's friend was looking at, because the landlord is the government. Whereas on this particular property, my daughter's friend had her eye on, it's a private landlord. So, you don't really want to be dealing with a private landlord who's holding the cards in a land lease situation.
Right.
The government could be a little bit more forgiving, let's say, because there are political and other ramifications if they bring the hammer down on the lease.
Right. So let's say you're in a land lease building and you've been there for a long time, and all of a sudden the lease is, everyone in the building says, "Hey, wait a minute, our lease is about to expire." How do you extend that? Do you negotiate that with the landlord, or how do you extend that?
Yeah, ideally the board is on top of that situation, which they would be, because it's going to be a big part of the maintenance payments every year from its shareholders goes to paying that land lease. So they're always going to have their eye on where are we with this lease? What is a good time to renegotiate?
Mm.
It takes two to tango, though. You have to get the landlord interested. He may or may not, or she may or may not be interested, because maybe they just like the cash flow. But that's a constant concern, or should be, for any board of directors of a co-op
Mm.
that's looking out for its shareholders' interests, because I'm unaware of it ever happening, but potentially it's devastating if that lease expires and there's no new deal. So, the board really has to stay on top of it and try and figure out when the best time and the best method of dealing with that expiring lease is. And a big point is buyers should understand that if a lease has less than 30 years to go, 30 years being the big term for mortgages, lenders almost never will lend, because they can't protect their asset if the lease expires before the mortgage term, because theoretically the landlord could evict everybody out of their apartments, and the lender is left with a big problem. So land leases, once they get to that 30-year mark, that's a really critical point.
Right, and I guess that would be the same situation with an underlying mortgage, right? So if you have an underlying mortgage on the building, that's 30 years old, like some of these buildings, in addition to land leases, when you see a high maintenance, it's one or the other, right? It's either like they've got a super high maintenance and you look like, why is this maintenance so high? It's because, they got into a loan on the building. It was 14% 20 years ago when they're locked in, or it's a land lease. So I guess you have to look at both and try to, if a mortgage is coming up, the shareholders or the HOA of the condo have to look at it and say, okay, we have to call the bank and renegotiate.
Yeah, the mortgage situation is more forgiving. That's a fairly common scenario, because, mortgages expire, so unless there's something really wrong with the building, most lenders understand that, that mortgage will be refinanced at the appropriate time. But that's another thing board members need to look at, because also they should always have an eye on, is it time for me to refinance that mortgage where I can lower the rate the building is paying and maybe even get some cash back to fund some projects. But that's a topic for another day.
Yeah, we can get into that at another time about the capital reserve and maintenance and tax deductibility and debt to income ratios and how that affects. But the takeaway that I got today, Ira, was that when I'm out with a customer looking at property, just like your daughter's friend, that if we see a high maintenance, it's either it's a land lease or there's a high underlying mortgage on the building, or there's a ton of services in the building, right? There's a pool, there's a gym, there's a roof deck, a movie room, a dog grooming, a massive, yoga studio. Those all add to the maintenance as well. So those are some of the things we have to look out for.
Yeah, I think you said it best when we opened this conversation, and it really applied to my daughter's friend. Um, if it seems too good to be true, if you're getting a one-bedroom apartment in a great area of Manhattan for a little over $100,000, I know the warning bells would go off in your head just like they went off in my head. And you need to have both the broker and the attorney dig deep and find out what's going on.
Right. I mean, we're both seasoned enough now to know that that New York City skepticism comes in, but there's usually a reason now. The scams are, real estate, maybe in a rental, a Craigslist rental or something like that. There would be a scam, Airbnb, but in sales, you can get. I've never seen it. I mean, maybe back in the day, I've seen some fishy deals that I've walked away from. But so the takeaway is when you're looking at apartments and you see a price, make sure you look at the maintenance, find out if it's a land lease, it's got really incredible services in the building, or there's a high underlying mortgage on that maintenance. And we'll dig into that another time, because there can be advantages on a high underlying mortgage on a building, because you get a deduction for interest, right, on that mortgage. So we can talk about that another time. Ira, you're the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed. Nice being with you again.
As well. Have a great day.
You too.